let's talk about program rankings. Program rankings are an interesting issue that we're going on. U.S. News and World Report are the rankings that everybody knows because they've been around. Universities often say we're not interested in these rankings. And in fact, some of the big medical schools like Harvard Medical School said we're not going to be a part of the rankings. We're not going to do that anymore. If you'll notice, they're still a part of the rankings because U.S. News and World Report still ranks them. The difference is that the universities no longer send information in. And what U.S. News and World Report requires them to do is to send information in, and then they take that information and then they do some comparisons. Okay. Now, even though the universities tell you, oh no, we don't really care about the rankings, or we don't, we're above the rankings or any of that kind of stuff, that's not true. They're desperate for the rankings. The reason is a lot of funding will come in. You'll get donors who will give you money. Harvard gets a lot of their money, for example, just the university in general, because they're so highly ranked and so highly, they have a good reputation. Not because they need the money. In fact, their endowment is huge. It's billions of dollars. They don't need the money, but people want to say, yes, I gave money to them, or they want something at Harvard named after them. When indeed the money would be much better spent someplace else, but people want to be associated with that. Well, how do you know if a school is really good? How are they ranked? We love rankings. I will tell you, I think they're not good. I don't think that they're helpful. I don't think that they are how you should make your decision, but let me go over it a little bit to explain a little bit more why that is. And I'll take you through a lot of the rankings and what they're looking at. Okay. By the way, you can find rankings other than U.S. News and World Report. Unfortunately, most of the rankings, if you just go look at them, if you just Google them online, most of the rankings are actually paid advertisements and you won't know it. There are places that buy a website basically that say they're doing rankings, but they're actually not that at all. They are putting together things where they've gotten advertisements from other universities and put them in. So you can't trust a lot of them. Again, you have to do a lot of homework to make sure. But let me tell you about basically what happens in U.S. News and World Report. One of the top things that they do is the reputation, which is having other people in the field or just other people in general in academia rank the program. But think about that for just a second. If I'm ranking something that way, let's assume you know Harvard University, right? You know Yale, you know Stanford. Those automatically bring up these images for you. And you may go, if they say, well, how good is that school? You may go, well, Harvard's great because I've heard about it. Everyone says it's great. And it is. There's no doubt it's a great school. But have you been there? Have you studied it? Have you gone through their program? How well do you know all the professors there? Well, probably most of us don't know much about it. I've never been on Harvard's campus before. I've seen pictures of it, but I've never actually been on the campus before. I know a guy who I went to graduate school with who did his undergraduate there, and I think that's my closest connection with Harvard University, other than having read some articles by people who work there. In other words, the reputation often comes just from a long-term reputation, and U.S. News and World Report asks people to rank it based upon that reputation. How good do you think they are? But again, it's more of an old-time reputation rather than, do you really know how good it is? So should you rank it on reputation, or should you rank it on how good the program is? Well, officially, it's how good the program is, really, but it ends up being what I've got here, which is what's the reputation of it, because most of us don't know how good it really is because we haven't actually been there and educated there. We know some of the research that's coming out of there. We may know a professional person that's there. We may know something about it, but we usually don't know a ton. And think about it, of the hundreds of universities that are out there, how could we possibly know? And ones we haven't heard of before, it doesn't mean they're not great. It just means I've not heard of it. Okay. That becomes one of the problems. They look at publications. And what happens is in the rankings, and this is true across the board, both the undergraduate rankings they do and the graduate rankings, they don't rank it based upon how good are the clinical services. Nobody knows how good the clinical services are because those aren't published specifically, but articles are published. So publications, research So what you're going to find is research universities are always going to rise to the top of the rankings. And the reason that they are is because they publish more. So they're going to have a lot more. Larger departments will then publish even more. So think about it this way. If you've got a department that has 30 faculty and each publishes 10 a year, which would be massive. That would be a ton of publications. But I'm using those numbers just because they're easy for me to figure out in my head. That would be 300 publications coming out of there a year, right? 30 faculty, 10 publications. Now you've got another set of faculty over here. They've got 10 people on faculty, and they're each publishing 20 a year, which would be like unheard of, but let's assume that that happened. And they're publishing 20 a year. They get, 200, that's 10 of them, that's 200 publications. That's fewer publications, but each person is actually publishing more. But depending on how you're looking at it, what do you count as more important? The number of publications per person, the number of publications absolute. Well, they look at both of those to some degree, but what ends up happening is the larger programs, in essence, are going to publish a lot more. They're going to be more seen. As a result, both the reputation is going to be higher, but when you're counting just publications and how good the program is, you're going to be doing it that way. But remember, the program could be great clinically, but you never capture that in any of these, in any of this data. Also, remember, the data is being sent by the university to U.S. News and World Report. So that means it's what the university sends. Perhaps not surprisingly to you, some of these numbers, especially the next ones we're going to be talking about, are sometimes been found to be fudged because programs do care and they will fudge the numbers in order to make themselves look a little bit better. Here's a good place that we know that that's happened. There's evidence of that having happened. Faculty, do they have full-time faculty compared to non-tenured or adjunct faculty? Full-time tenured faculty it's rated as higher. It's because the idea is that if you have these stable full-time tenured people here, that you have a higher quality or higher level of program. That may be true, but think about it this way. If you have some non-tenured people or adjunct faculty, is it possible they bring something else into it? Now, it is nice that the university is willing to pay money for the full-time tenured faculty, because what that says is that they're willing to put in the resources, and that's a lot of it. Faculty resources plays a big deal here. But let's assume that they have quite a few of non-tenured or adjunct faculty. Those may be people who are not doing research, but they come at it from a different angle. I'll give you an example outside of the field of mental health. My son, who is getting a degree in computer science, has had a number of adjunct faculty in his computer science program that he has preferred because they are not full-time academics, but they are people who work at Microsoft, people who work at Texas Instruments, people who work directly in the computer science field on a daily basis. They come in to teach a class, and they teach a class specifically on the things that are happening in the real world. That doesn't mean that tenured faculty can't do that, but it means tenured faculty are spending their time doing research and working on, in many cases, a connection with businesses and corporations. So there is that back and forth, but there's certainly nothing wrong with having somebody come in from the outside who their whole job is doing nothing but working in a field. And that can happen in psychology. You can have someone teaching a class who's a full-time therapist who can tell you, here's what the research says about therapeutic interventions. Here's what it looks like in this particular population outside of a research setting. I came in academia from the clinical world, and I spent most of my life in the clinical world and doing administration. All the way along, I've taught, and towards the back end of my career, I've been teaching full-time with only a small amount of clinical work along the way. But I amassed, over 13,000 clients because I've worked with so many different people. I can tell you a lot about what these things look like outside of a textbook. So I bring something different to it than the full-time researcher would bring to it. Both are valuable, both are helpful, but one is in the rankings considered to be less important than the other. And that may not be true for you. Student selectivity. In other words, are you selecting the best students? This is where GPA often comes in. In other words, the program likes to be able to go out there and say, guess what? I only take the best people. We only take those with high GPAs. And the average GPA for our program is a 3.8 compared to this other program over here where their average GPA is a 3.4. We clearly have better students. And they will publish that big time out there. They will put that everywhere about what it is. And they'll be proud of that. And partially they should. But, we know that GPAs have inflated a ton over the last 20 years or so. And we know there's a number of factors that go into this inflated GPA that doesn't necessarily capture really what's going on out there with people. And so it's quite possible that a school that is regularly letting in people with a 3.2, 3.3, 3.4 may actually have some excellent people. And so we don't want to discount that. But that's, by the way, one of the reasons why GPA is actually more important than a lot of people will tell you that it is, because it kind of is that first cut that they use. And teacher to student ratios is another thing that they'll often use. The problem with that is that oftentimes they're not actually true. For example, in our graduate program, the teacher to student ratios varies depending on how many we accepted in. So if we accepted 4 that year, it's wildly different than if we had extra funding to have 8. Because our program is really small, the ratios can change dramatically over time. And so, again, in a program, perhaps if you had, 100 people in the program and only, 5 licensed professionals in it, that would be out of whack in terms of it. But the other ones may not mean that much, but they do. And by modifying those ratios, by the way, the university can present to U.S. News and World Report a modification of what is really happening there. And U.S. News and World Report will rank them higher. So these things happen. So don't get too stuck on these. The rankings give you a snapshot. Think of the program rankings as purely a snapshot of what's going on. And you're better off choosing not based upon the ranking, but based upon, is it accredited and does it have the training that I want in it?